Part of what we're going to do throughout this week is try to identify, actually, key things, key people, key influences, key interactions with God that shape us, and learn how to see those, learn how to recognize those, learn how to respond to God in the midst of those. All right? If we understand them, we can respond better. And we also need to be aware of them because God uses those things to shape and develop our life messages. Okay? And that is part of what you will be doing on Friday. All right? I can't teach a week without getting you to prepare something in terms of preaching and teaching. It won't be long. All right? It'll be shorter than what you do for other things. But central to our lives as a preacher and teacher is the fact that God gives us things that are life messages. Okay? And I believe that's true for all of us. We will be preachers and teachers of the whole word, all right? But the specific things that God has used that are sovereign foundations in our lives, that are unique to who we are, the certain things that God speaks to us, ways he responds to us, ways he leads us, all right, that are life messages. A lot of times it's things we have to overcome, okay? Things that he gives us faith and vision for, but they often come out of the crucible, all right, the hot pot, all right, of our lives. They're very significant shaping events that shape the messages that God gives us, okay? And so we're going to be talking about this week as we go on this journey of what is involved in developing a lifestyle of a preacher and teacher and becoming a person that God can use and speak through in this way, is be looking at what are the life messages God has given you. There's a tremendous amount of authority that comes with the life messages that God gives us because they come out of lived experience, okay? Lived experience that we've met God in. And so we have faith for others because we've experienced God in this way ourselves, okay? And this is part of the raw material, okay, that our life brings, the sovereignty of God. Even for me in this last journey, which was totally unexpected, of stepping down, there's a message that God is shaping in me to be able to speak to parents that have children with disabilities. All right, to be able to respond when something takes you totally by surprise and tests every area of faith in your life. All right, what to do when you experience life crises. Right, and how to find God in the midst of that, how to respond in it. Right, these become things that God uses that give us faith for others, that give us messages that come with authority. All right, and so this is going to be a part of what you do this week. We're going to be thinking about your life messages, what God has done. When I was 15, my family moved from England to Hawaii. And that was a very significant move for me. I'd just become a Christian a year before, living in Hawaii. And my parents actually got separated. My mom stayed in Hawaii, and we moved to California with my dad. And one of my brothers, my eldest brother, went away to college. So from 5 of us, it went to 3 of us in California. But it was very significant for me because before leaving Hawaii, God gave me 3 significant words. I was a new believer, right? I'd only been walking with God for a year. And God spoke to me, and one of the things he spoke to me was a promise for my family. My parents were getting separated, but God spoke to me and said, I will bring your parents back together. That took place 2.5 years later. But it was a promise I clung to and prayed for and gave me great hope. He gave me a promise that my second brother, who was moving with us, would come to faith. And in our high school that we moved to, he got involved with the soccer team right away. And there was a time that this was a unique, perhaps Californian Christian experience, that there were these teachers that would go around and were talking about the perils of rock music at that particular time. So some funny things in there, and they would talk about fears of things called backward masking. So there's a lot of funny things along with the teaching that if you play the needle backwards on a record player, which you can't do anymore, you can't do that on a CD. Or you somehow played a tape backwards, you could hear terrible things of, like, demons or Satan or 666 or funny things. It always, even then it made me laugh because I thought, well, actually you can just listen to it forwards and tell whether they're really communicating something that's for God or not. Why go backwards, It's not that complicated. But anyway, in spite of all of that, that platform that was used, there were a lot of teachers that came through at that time. But they also communicated the gospel. And it so happened that there was kind of a move of God in my brother's soccer team, and I think 10 of the soccer team members came to faith. My brother was one of them. And then the third word that God gave me before we were moving was that there was a place for me. He had prepared a place for me to grow. I was very concerned about that. I was the only one going to church in my family. In Hawaii when I got saved, and I was able to get to church because a family friend would pick me up and take me. So I was concerned about moving because I was too young to drive. My dad was definitely not for me having a life of faith. He sat me down early on. A little faith's okay, Melanie, but don't go overboard. So I completely ignored my father's advice, but that was a real concern, would he allow me to go to church? How would I get to church? So that was a significant concern for me in our relocation. But one of the words God gave me was that he had prepared a place for me, that there was a church, there was somewhere where I was going to grow. Sometimes it's funny the way God does it, he speaks to you as if he's prepared this place and it's all for me, you know what I mean? Because he's speaking to a 14-year-old. That was very significant. I needed to know that God as a father had something for me. But anyway, the church that I ended up being a part of was through different people I met. It was a vineyard church at that time. At that time, it was a Calvary Chapel. And started going to this church. And the thing that was significant, and this made my dad very nervous, is I would come home sort of glowing every week from church. And, California, if you go to anywhere around the world, California kind of has a reputation for cults. And so my dad was certainly concerned that, I was getting involved in some kind of cult that was focusing on, emotional manipulation of some sort or another. But I would go to church, and there was a man there who was preaching, and he handled the word very well. It made sense to me. He handled the word very well. He spent a lot of time in the Gospels. He did teach through the whole Bible, but the Calvary Chapel movement as a whole was known for systematic Bible teaching. So he did that, and he did that well. But he was a great storyteller. But a very significant factor was right here, and it had to do with his transparency, his own journey. At that time when he was pastoring, most of the church were under 25. About 80% of the church were under 25, and he was in his mid-40s. And he had actually come through a significant time of disillusionment and failure. Not in terms of he had had a significant moral failure per se, but just the sense of disconnect that what I know, my life just doesn't measure up to what I know. Who I am doesn't measure up to what I see that we're called to be. And a sense of just disappointment with God, disappointment with the Christian life, not wanting to pretend. And God spoke to him significantly. He had planted another church, and God spoke to him one day and said, "If you weren't the pastor of this church, would you come?" That's a significant test. If you weren't the pastor, if you didn't have to show up every Sunday, would you want to come to this church? And he sort of came to terms with that and went, actually, no, I don't really want to come to this church. And there was part of that process that was kind of a crisis of faith for him, where he was teaching the word on a regular basis. But he never picked up the word just to read it for himself. All right, so he had gotten into a lifestyle of a preacher and teacher where professionally he was preaching and teaching all the time with quite a lot of effectiveness, actually. But his own life with God had been unanchored, right? He had run adrift. Where he had run adrift in this area, all right, and he had explained, but he was no longer really closely, personally, intimately connected to the source. Okay, and so he had sort of left that, and he had come back into the ministry after a time of just, like I said, that sort of personal sense of disillusionment with himself. Is this livable? Can I do it? Is it, is transformation and that kind of rooted relationship really possible? Just saying, I need to experience God in a new way. And there needs to be new life. So it's not about words, it's not about competence alone, but there's a deep sense of rootedness. And I think this man, at that time when I came into the church had been going on for about 3 or 4 years. And the reason he, probably more than any, and there's been lots of people who've had influence on my life, a large number of them since then have been written teachers and preachers. It's been actually through their written word rather than hearing them that have had a large influence on me. But the significant thing for me in encountering him is when he spoke out of his own brokenness. There was no pretense. There was no pretense. He was very authentic, very genuine, transparent. He shared his life journey, his successes and his failures in that process. And in the midst of that, he had experienced a genuine work of grace, a genuine encounter with the living God that said, God is big enough for all of it. God is big enough for all of it. All of it is, all of your life, it's about a life of grace. It's about a life of genuine encounter with God. And because of that, he was able to preach with faith and have faith for others. That no matter what you'd experienced, whether we can have an experience with Christ early, and we can experience the grace of God early when we come to faith. But what happens when you've been in ministry for a while and you experience failure? You almost feel like, how do I get saved again? Right? And he had experienced grace in that too. From the beginning and from the end, and I was experiencing what does it look like to live out of that grace. And so this man was very, very significant in my life, and more than probably any other has shaped my life and ministry, because he was able to, he loved people. That was very, very clear. He definitely was somebody I wanted to imitate. He was actually strong in all of these areas. In his character, and his character, it didn't mean that he hadn't failed, but he wasn't hidden in his failure. He could explain and invite you into the journey of faith and the journey of grace, and he could help you see how failure is overcome and how God works with you to turn that around and to use it for his glory, but also how he can help you grow and develop so that you don't experience other failures, right? I mean, God is big enough for it all, but he does want to help us overcome sin, not just have a life of perpetually being forgiven sin, right? So you've got to have faith for that there is another life possible. And he invited us into that. He had a tremendous kingdom perspective. All right, he was for the whole body of Christ. That significantly impacted me. He was for the whole body of Christ. And this kind of kingdom perspective that everybody was invited in. And everybody was invited to participate with what God was doing. Very, very significant. Going to church was fun. Going to church was unexpected. You got there and you didn't know what God would do tonight. And you were eager to hear what he was going to say and what he was going to do. And so there was a strong correspondence between, the word and the application, and it was right there. There wasn't a big gap between these two things. He was strong in the word, but it was also very, very practical. And you would practice what God was doing in church. And so it was exciting to be there. It was more like going to a college football practice or something. You got to play. You got to be in the game when you went to church, not just a spectator. You were on the field and you were learning. So he had had this, and he had had this. Then he lost this in the journey. And after a while, had to lay down this and come back here again. And then God in his grace and mercy restored this and ended up bringing a great deal of fruit. And I think the aftermath, the lessons learned, and the second phase of ministry after the restoration was significant. We have to begin here with character, and then it moves forward into competence, into skills, into our word and communication. Okay, although part of building character is how we're personally interacting with this, right? How we're personally interacting with God and his word is part of what forms our character. But it's an internal work first before it becomes a fruitful work, right? So that's very significant. And part of what I want you to do, I want you to think about sovereign foundations, okay? Sovereign foundations are central to who God has made us. And sovereign foundations have to do with where we're born, our family, and our growing up experience, our childhood experience. Right? Part of my sovereign foundations are that I was brought up in England originally. My family's British. We were not a church-going family, but we were a family that went to church with school events. All right, at that time in England, different school events took place in the church on a regular basis. All right, and so during those times, I had a chance to hear the gospel. Okay, so that's part of my sovereign foundations. That I moved from England to Hawaii and all that was involved with that. That in that move from England to Hawaii, my parents' marriage started to break apart. And yet that was significant because that dislocation from my culture, that dislocation from my family with its internal struggles, opened my heart towards God and made me looking for something that was much more secure, much more significant, much more trustworthy. That was part of the sovereign foundation of God working in my life. And then that I met and was taken to church by a family friend. So these kinds of things, and then the move to California, all right? These things are all about sovereign foundations. The fact that I was the youngest and the only girl in my family, all right? Different events and different circumstances that shape who we are. And some of them may seem negative, right? A child of a broken family, that may seem negative, but it was a sovereign foundation that we believe as Christians, right? God uses everything. Nothing is lost. The evil one, Satan, never has the last word on anything that's happened in our lives. It does not mean that everything is good, but it does mean God uses everything for good. Right? And part of coming to terms and being able to integrate what God is doing in our life, and very shaping to our character is being able to see what's happened sovereignly in our lives just by where we're born, what country we're in, our family life and circumstances, and the events of our childhood, how God is at work in that. Okay? That is absolutely essential. If we cannot see how God is at work in that, everything we're doing is always trying to fill the vacuum from that time. It's a loss that has to be filled, all right? And that will affect and undermine our life as a preacher and teacher, okay? Does that make sense? So it's absolutely essential that we stop and reflect on our sovereign foundations and ask the question, how has God been at work in this and used it to shape me, to make me a tool in his hand, a gift? How is he using this for good? And reflect on your sovereign foundations. Okay? How God has been at work in your life through your childhood. I'm not talking about how you specifically have interacted with God. I'm just talking about sovereign. It happened to you. Where you were born, the type of family you were in, the conflicts that may have been around you, or maybe whether it was a wealthy family or a poor family, whether it was harmonious relationships, difficult ones. All right, all of these are sovereign. You didn't ask for them. They just were where you were born into. Okay, the circumstances and the situations of your early life. So you want to reflect on what those were, what was significant about them, and ask, how has God used those to shape me? How has God used those to shape me? Right? Becoming a believer, growing up in Nepal, has shaped Robin differently than for me growing up in England, Hawaii, and California. Right? There's a different shaping experience that makes Robin a unique contribution, a unique gift to the body of Christ. Right? And that's true for each one of us in our circumstances, our locations. God has set us in families. He's set us in countries. He's set us in nations. The experiences and circumstances of our life, God is at work in them and through them to use them for his glory. And we want to understand those. Okay? And be able to come to a place of thanksgiving for what God has done. Okay? The good and the bad, to come to a place of acceptance to say, God has been at work, whether it's been an extremely difficult sovereign foundation. Some of you may have had extremely difficult situations. Others of you may have had very easy, comfortable ones. Okay? But either way, no matter what, we have to come to a place of acceptance and peace and understanding of, God, you have been at work, and this has shaped me. Make sense? Okay. So, in terms of some initial observations, what we see is that character is foundational, isn't it? Somebody can significantly influence you, even if they're not super strong in the word or in their communication because of their life lived, right? Their life lived. However, we see that God's goal for us is that all of these would line up, all right? And so it's not that we want one over another. We want all of them. Because in terms of effectiveness, the effectiveness as a preacher and teacher is magnified with all of them. But this is our foundation, this is our anchor, this is our source. Without this, if this at any time withers and dies, this will follow. Right? Okay, now I want you to do something else. I want you to stop and reflect on somebody who has been a good teacher, but you've experienced disillusionment with. Somebody who isn't somebody who's influenced you for good in that sense, but as a teacher that has experienced failure. Okay? A preacher, a teacher. But there's been failure in their lives that has undermined their influence. Okay? Does that make sense? Understand the question? Failure in their lives that's undermined their influence.